Now, the literature is this. It's a paper that has been published in the journal Philosophy of Science, volume 85 in 2018, What Preferences Really Are. Erik Angner is got two PhDs, one in economics and one in philosophy of science. And at the moment, he is professor of practical philosophy at Stockholm University in Sweden. And as far as I can see, the most important publication is a course in behavioral economics that appeared with Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. Now, this is the target of Angner's criticism, namely being directed at Hausman, the book that we've been discussing in the earlier session. Now, the first target of Angner's criticism is that Hausman's claim that in economics preferences are comparative subjective evaluations, and the second one is that in economics preferences should be total subjective comparative evaluations. So Angner criticizes Hausman on both fronts, both on the descriptive side, that this is how preferences are handled in economics, and second, also on the normative side, that they should be handled like that in economics. So it's a total confrontation, in a sense, of Hausman's analysis. Instead, this is now the positive alternative that Angner suggests. Preference in economics is an undefined term. It's a primitive, as it's called in the terminology then of logics and philosophy of science. It's an undefined primitive in economics. So what happens in economics is that you use the term preference without a explicit definition. Now this, of course, provokes the question, well, if you don't define it, how do you know what you are talking about? And this is then number 4 of Angner's suggestions. He says that Hausman's explication of preference is only a model of the axioms for preference. Now, this is for our everyday understanding of the term model, a strange use of the term model, but this is exactly the understanding of the term model as it is used in logics and in axiomatic theory, namely a model of a set of axioms is an example fulfilling the axioms. So what Angner says is that although preference in economics is not used in the sense as Hausman suggests, but the definition of preference as it is done by Hausman does fulfill the axioms of expected utility theory. Now, let's go to the arguments. First, in the descriptive area, Angner claims that preferences in economics are not total comparative evaluations that, according to Hausman, are formed in a demanding cognitive process of reflection on partial evaluations. Now, first of all, Angner claims preferences in economics aren't used in this way, that only total comparative evaluations are subsumed under this concept. And how can Angner argue that? Well, he says the evidence for this claim comes from structure of economist theories as presented in prominent textbooks. So he goes through several textbooks and shows that preferences are not used in the way that Hausman proposes, but they are used differently, and we'll come back to that. The second argument, or the second source of evidence, is the history of economics. When you look at classical texts in economics, preferences are not used in the way that Hausman proposes. And then if you look at economic practice, then you also see that economists use preferences in a different way. And in these different domains of economics, Angner claims that preferences are treated as primitives, explicitly and adamantly rejecting the notion that economics should explain how preferences are formed and why they have features such as transitivity and completeness. So in other words, these properties of the concept of preferences are not explicated in the way that Hausman says, but it's different. And I'll come to the positive description that Angner gives for preferences. In fact, it is so that empirical research suggests that preferences revealed in observed behavior are not in general formed in a process of reflection. So if you really empirically analyze the choices of people, and then you conclude what the underlying preferences are, then, this is what Angner claims, this gets to the conclusion that there is no such process in general that Hausman describes in the formation of preferences. Now, this was the descriptive side, that he says that Hausman is descriptively inaccurate as far as economic practice is concerned, but he also says that it wouldn't be a good suggestion to economists now in the future to use preferences in the sense that Hausman favors as comparative total evaluations. So these observations suggest that economists should not accept Hausman's account of preferences as the result of a cognitively demanding process. And as Angner adds, this is really a view of preferences that belongs to the 19th century, in other words, to the classical period of economics, in which you have indeed attempts to define what preferences are, typically in terms of psychological processes or mental states. Whereas in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, this view has been completely abandoned in 20th century economics. I explained that already, that in this domain of economics, people think of preferences as something which you can somehow derive from choices, but certainly you don't give it an interpretation in terms of mental states. Now, the question then is, if preferences indeed are not defined in economic practice, and they shouldn't be defined in economic practice, how can you get meaning to that concept without a definition? How is it, in other words, connected to empirical phenomena? So if you claim that a term does not get its meaning by a definition, you have to give another story how this term gets any meaning such that people know how to use it, and especially use it in the same sense as their colleagues. Now, if you look at mathematics, in which terms are used in the context of axiomatic systems, then the standard view is that the primitives occurring in these axioms have implicitly gotten a meaning by being part of these axioms, or as this is often expressed, that the axioms implicitly define the terms occurring in them. Now, this is of course not a full-fledged definition, but it's certainly so that the terms as they are used in mathematics then have to obey and fulfill the axioms. For instance, if one asked what a natural number is, the appropriate answer is, it is an element of a set that fulfills Peano's axioms. Peano's axioms have been invented in the 19th century, late 19th century or early 20th century, and they describe how natural numbers behave. A further definition of what a natural number is beyond what is in the axioms is usually not given in mathematics. Now, this idea that the main source of meaning for concepts that occur in sets of axioms, that idea can be transferred to economics. And that is what Angner does. He says preferences are whatever the axioms implicitly say they are. So they just fulfill the axioms that are given for choice theory. But in addition, one needs a connection of these implicitly defined preferences to empirical phenomena, because the axioms only tell you certain, so to speak, internal properties of the preferences, but they don't tell you how to connect the preferences to what you can observe in social practice. Now, this is done, as Angner claims, by so-called correspondence rule. And correspondence rule are a topic that has been widely discussed over many decades in philosophy of science. And it's something that gives you rules how to connect theoretical terms, terms that are not derived immediately from empirical observations, how these theoretical terms connect to empirical phenomena. And for preferences, in many cases, it's an obvious corresponding rule to say if an agent A prefers X to Y, then A will not choose Y when X is available. Note that this is not a definition. This is too weak to be a definition of preference. And also Hausman has correctly observed that in chapter 3, but it suffices for the application of preference in many contexts. And this is the way that modern economics, modern neoclassical economics, meaning post-war, post-Second World War economics, uses preference in this sense and not by filling it up with some content that must come from psychology, because then otherwise preference would be a mental state. Now, the consequence then is that Angner draws that the whole enterprise of Hausman, namely trying to define preferences in whichever way, is wrong-headed. If you really want to adequately represent the practice of economics, it's not by giving a definition of how economists use the concept of preference, but it's really giving only these correspondence rules. These theoretical terms, like preferences, again, theoretical terms meaning you cannot immediately observe them. Such theoretical terms function in science not by definitions quite generally, but by various context-dependent correspondence rules. So the point is, contrary to many biases, that many terms in the sciences, and now including economics, don't get their meaning by explicit definitions. This is something which is deep in the Western tradition, starting with Socrates and Plato, where the theory has been forwarded that terms only have a meaning if there is a definition for them, and this does not really adequately represent how in the sciences terms are used. In general, this is what Angner then claims, philosophers trying to define theoretical scientific concepts are on the wrong track, because that would be an undue restraint on scientific practice. Scientists themselves are happily using theoretical scientific concepts without definitions. They have very often, at least in the natural sciences, a consensus about them, but that consensus is not constructed by a definition of the respective theoretical term, but by its use in concrete examples in which correspondence rules come into play. Nevertheless, what Angner concedes is that Hausman has delivered something useful, namely a model of the axioms. And as I explained, this means a concrete example of a concept of preference that fulfills the axioms. And such a model may have various heuristic, pedagogical, or illustrative functions in economics, and therefore I will discuss it here, then especially in the next section. So we have the criticism of Angner's amounts to a criticism that Hausman's enterprise of defining preferences as they are used in economics is wrong-headed. Nevertheless, there is a smaller achievement, namely that we have a model of the axioms that preferences have to fulfill. And this model, in the sense of a concrete example of what preferences could be, may have various functions, although it does not capture the general practice of economics.